Accident victims like you deserve better. A husband and wife were rear-ended, and insurance offered them $10,000. We litigated the case and got them $375,000. Qualified expert attorneys can get you more. Call Zirkin and Smerling today.
Good afternoon, Baltimore City. This is City Voters Live Podcast. I'm your host, Desmond Stinney, and today we have a very special show. We've got Councilman Costello joining us in studio today with all of the discussion around the Harborplace Revitalization and the plans by real estate developer MCB. And the forthcoming legislative package to be introduced to the council coming up February 13th. We thought it would be a great opportunity for us to dive into the legislative package with the councilman as well as some distinguished panelists and give the public an opportunity to hear, just the purpose of the bills. And their intention and what their potential impact is. But first, let me give the councilman a chance to say hello to Baltimore City. How you doing, Councilman Costello?
Hey, thanks for having me on today, Desmond. Doing great.
Really appreciate you taking time out of your hectic schedule. I know you got a lot going on, so making time for City Voters Live and the members and viewers of Baltimore City Voters. We really appreciate you taking the time. And but at this time, I'd like to also introduce one of our panelists today, Mr. David Tafaro. How you doing, David?
Good. Thank you for having me on and engaging in this dialogue.
Excellent. And just to give the viewers and voters of Baltimore City a little bit of information, David Tafaro has been one of the most prolific real estate developers in Baltimore and Maryland over the past 50 years and has been involved in a wide range of civic activities over that same period. He is the founder and principal of Terra Nova Ventures, a real estate development company. During the entire period that David has lived in Baltimore City, and that's since 1973, he's been engaged in a variety of housing and community revitalization activities and nonprofit organizations, including the Neighborhood Design Center, Baltimore Housing Partnership, Baltimore Heritage, the Roland Park Community Foundation, Friends of the Jones Falls, Leaders Committee of the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, the Maryland Film Festival, and Maryland State Board of Education, among others. Tafaro's work has left behind a lifetime legacy of high-quality work that has enhanced the environments in all the communities in which he developed his properties. Quite a distinguished background, David, and we're certainly glad to have you join City Voters Live Podcast today and offering your insight and expertise in looking at the legislative package for Harborplace.
Thank you. Almost sounds like I would have written that.
Well, I tell you what, I don't think I write that well, so I think the cat's out of the bag on that one. But that only encapsulates part of your work. But so if you guys don't mind, we'll just we'll jump right into it. For the viewers. And obviously, we know that the Harborplace is in significant disrepair. I think everyone has a desire to see it be better than what it is today. And the challenge here is finding out and determining what the best course and path is for the future of Harborplace. There's been a plan introducce. I think the overwhelming impetus of the plan is to build an economically sustainable and something that will last, something that will take us into the next iteration of what the harbor can and should be. And to do that, it definitely seems that the direction that's headed in is kind of repurposing what the use of that space can be. And to do that, it required some changes to various aspects of it. And I think that's what these bills are really about. So we'll jump right into the bills are 23-0444, 23-0446, and 23-0448. We'll talk about each one of those, separately. So starting with 0444, and that's a charter amendment. And the summary of the bill reads, for the purpose of amending the provision dedicating for public park uses the portion of the city that lies along the northwest and south shores of the Inner Harbor, south of Pratt Street to the water's edge, east of Light Street to the water's edge, and north of Key Highway to the water's edge, from the World Trade Center Tower around the shoreline of the Inner Harbor and including Rash Field to permit multifamily, residential, and off-street parking within the dedicated boundaries of Inner Harbor Park, and submitting this amendment to the qualified voters of the city for adoption or rejection. So 23-044 is the bill that deals with, the permitted use within, as stated within our Baltimore City Charter of the Inner Harbor. And what I'll do at this point is give the councilman a couple of minutes to talk about this bill and discuss with the voters, what it means, for this project and the future of Baltimore.
Thanks, Desmond. So this is a charter amendment. Important context here. There are two ways you can get a charter amendment in front of the voters of the city. One is through petition and one is through the city council ordinance. So we're going through the city council ordinance. So this is very similar to any city council bill you would have, with the exception of if it's passed by the council and signed by the mayor, then it ends up on the ballot for the qualified voters in November, and it requires approval by the voters. So this charter amendment does a couple of things. One, it increases the available area of ground leased area from 3.2 to 4.5 acres. Second, it clarifies some specific language in the charter, and that's around commercial uses. So pursuant to state law, commercial uses do include multifamily, and they do include off-street parking. And this essentially just clarifies that within the charter. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of what the city charter amendment does. Obviously, this one is very important. This is the one piece of the three companion bills piece of legislation that will have to go before the voters of the city in November.
Gotcha. Thank you, Councilman, for that explanation. Mr. Tafaro, you'll have some time to rebut that or discuss your feelings on the language and the councilman's explanation.
Sure. Thank you. Back, I guess, in the 60s, the Inner Harbor Park was created, and it was amended in 1978 or 79 when it went to a public referendum to allow the current pavilions. But I'd just like to read from the original charter as amended. There is hereby dedicated to public park uses for the benefit of this and future generations of the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland, the portion of the city that lies along the northwest and south shores. So in order, and then the amendment that was made to allow the pavilions said that except in order to provide eating places and other commercial uses. And I beg to differ with Councilman that this was a clarification. We know what this meant because there were proposals before the city. Other commercial uses might have meant the kite shop or the stuffed animal shops that were there originally. It was not intended to allow high-rise office towers or apartment towers in the park. So that's kind of a sleight of hand, which is unfortunate. We went to a very active public referendum in 1978 to allow the pavilions. The public got engaged in it. So I think this is a huge change from what the original intent was to make it and retain it as a public park for all residents and people from outside the city to come and visit.
So, Mr. Tafaro, are you stating that is this about intent or language? Does the language of commercial uses, as the councilman stated, does that is residential multifamily included in that definition of commercial uses on that state level?
It was not included in the original one, and that's why I'm saying the councilman calls it clarification. No, it is a distinct change because that was not what was contemplated at the time. It was not contemplated by the authors of the referendum or the voters who voted for that referendum. I just want to make it clear because this is what this is doing. This is putting what is on the other side of Light Street and Pratt Street, which are office buildings and apartment buildings and condominium buildings, like on 1414 Water Street, the glass building, 10 East Lee Street, the office buildings, the hotel. They are on the other sides of the roads. They are not in the Inner Harbor Park. The pavilions also are only 2 stories high. That was to make sure that no views were obstructed and that it had a scale that was pedestrian friendly.
Understood. Yeah, and the height is a part of a separate bill, which we'll discuss.
Separate bill, correct.
Yeah. Correct. Okay. Now, would you like to address Mr. Tafaro's remarks, Councilman?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. It's great to see you again. It's been some time. Couple things I'd like to note, and I'm hoping to have a positive conversation here today. So I do contest the characterization of my comments as being sleight of hand, as not being true. But I think there's a couple important things to note here. First, there is specific language in the charter, and it reads, and I quote, "to provide eating places, comma, other commercial uses." Other commercial uses, commercial, as defined by Maryland state law, doesn't.
No, I take issue. That's your interpretation. It says eating places and other commercial uses, meaning in the scale that was contemplated, like coffee shops, not high-rise multifamily.
But what we'll do, we'll give the councilman an opportunity to rebut the comments, and then we'll come back to you to speak on his comments.
Okay.
So I disagree. The city charter is currently written says to provide eating places, comma, other commercial uses. Nonetheless, I do think that it's important to note that when you look at the totality of 3 bills that have been introduced and the plans that have been presented by MCB, we're talking about an increase of nearly 5, specifically 4.8 acres in publicly available space, that being park space. And I think that's really important to note here. I do want to make one clarification, and this is not Desmond's fault, but when Desmond was reading the short title of the bill, I do want to note that nothing is permitted to be constructed south of Conway Street. And I know that wasn't to your point, David, but I just do think that's important context. And finally, I would note that Pratt Street and Light Street, to your comments about what is across the street, Pratt Street and Light Street have served as very significant barriers for an extended period of time, really since the inception of Harborplace 50 some odd years ago. And I think it's important to note that the uses that currently exist within Harborplace, limited as they may be, due to the fact that the property was ran into the ground by the previous property owner, that those uses also exist directly across the street, specifically at the gallery. And again, that property has suffered in a similar fashion. But these uses that currently exist are not unique to this side, the south side of Pratt, or the east side of Light Street.
Mr. Tavaro?
Well, I think that the question is that hasn't been addressed is we all know that the Harborplace pavilions have gone down into a state of inactivity and disrepair. But we've had no discussion in this whole thing since I guess the city and MCB started looking at it as to whether they could be reactivated. And I've talked to a lot of people that are involved in the original creation of Harborplace with the Rouse Company. And they believe that they can be reactivated, not necessarily strictly in the same form. They may be smaller, one might be eliminated. There are lots of things, but this isn't part of the debate. And I might add that from when MCB held its meetings, which were funded by the city to the tune of $1 million, which is highly unprecedented, they never disclosed in those meetings prior to October 30th that they were considering high rises. They were asking for input. And some very prominent people were present at those meetings. Rebecca Hoffberger is one of them, head of the founder and head of the American Visionary Art Museum, Ted Rouse, and others. So this has come out of left field, and the mayor has said this was kept secret from the public for 3 years.
Mr. Tafar, I want to make sure that we kind of stay there. There's a separate forum that is tomorrow that will be with executives from MCB here, where we will. I think that is more conversation topics for that, and I hope that you will join us, tomorrow evening, and you will certainly have every opportunity to raise these concerns. Today is literally about the 3 legislative bills. These are the councilman's bills that he's introducing, and the 2 points that I think for as far as takeaways on this particular bill that I think City Voters Live will follow up on with the councilman and you as a panelist, Mr. Tafaro, is the term commercial uses, what it does entail and doesn't entail, and the second is the same permitted uses were in effect, across on the other side of Light and Pratt Street. See, if that's the case, then we have to look at 414 Light Street, right, which is obviously above 100 feet. So those are 2 takeaways that I'm gathering. Would you agree?
Yeah, I just the question is who prepared the legislation? Why was it prepared in secret while the process was going on, and then only revealed to the public? The plans of MCP were only revealed to the public on October 30th for the first time. So this legislation was in the works for a long, long time. I would like to ask the councilman who actually prepared the legislation.
So a couple things that I think are important to note, and then I'm happy to answer your question, David. First, it is simply not economically viable or feasible to simply reactivate those pavilions and move forward. That is not sustainable, despite the fact that the MCB team has, I think, done a yeoman's job of reactivating those with local tenants. Second, no planning dollars were used for community engagement. So that is false. Third, the mayor did not say what you indicated that he said. Unfortunately, that is simply false. And fourth, I do want to point out that I think there's a very important discussion to be had about height and density and view corridors. And one of the reasons why folks across the city have such a great interest in what's being proposed has to do with accessibility to the water, because that's important to everyone. It's something that belongs to everyone. And I think the Ritz-Carlton project on Key Highway, which I know you're familiar with, folks who live there, I represent that area. I think that is a great case study in what can happen when there's a debate over height versus width. And what you have essentially on that corridor of Key Highway is an area which is completely blocked off to the public. And what has been proposed by MCB is essentially a reduction in the footprint of the existing pavilions and increases the sight lines to the water. With respect to who prepared the legislation, I introduced the legislation. The legislation was prepared by a land use attorney for MCB, and that is no different than any of the 150 plus some odd rezoning bills or zoning related bills that I've introduced in 9.5 years on the council. You know that as a local developer, that when you have a rezoning bill or you need a land use entitlement, you work with your land use attorney. That land use attorney contacts a member of the city council, and your land use attorney drafts up that legislation. The council member reviews it. They work with the Department of Legislative Reference. The bill is formatted, and then the bill is formally introduced to the council. So I know that you're very familiar with that process. So, but that's the answer to the question.
Okay. Eric, I appreciate the explanation, but you've left out one huge difference between zoning bills in general and this property. This is public property, as you know. The real estate is owned by the mayor and city council of Baltimore. So it does not fall into the category of projects that I've worked on private property. So it's not just one of another 150. This is the crown jewel of Baltimore City. So to suggest that that's the way the legislation would be prepared in the case of public property is really, that's very disappointing. And there's been no request for proposals in this whole process, which is the normal course of action, certainly on a major property. I should also say that without getting into the details of plans, the city was aware of official plans that were generated, and they seem to have been entirely ignored in this process, including what's known as Inner Harbor 2.0. Others can talk about it tomorrow, but that was generated by or commissioned by the Waterfront Partnership in order to reactivate the Inner Harbor. There's been no discussion publicly for you to say that it's not economically viable to reactivate the pavilions. I've got a lot of people disagree with that. And by the way, we don't know of any prominent person in this city who's not connected to the project who supports this legislation or the plans. And that's a former housing commissioners, Bob Embry, it's Jay Brody, it's architects throughout the city, Steve Ziegler, David Ben, Adam Gross. I can go on list and list. There's nobody that anybody can name that's not connected to the project who supports this legislation or the process that's been followed to get to the introduction to the legislation. And I'd like to ask a question. Does you're supporting the candidate, Sheila Dixon, former mayor, does she support this legislation?
I think, Mr. Tafaro, if we want to know how Miss Dixon feels, we can certainly invite her to the show and ask her opinion as well.
I'm asking because the councilman has contributed $6,000 to her campaign, and I think he supports this legislation. He introduced it. I think the public's entitled to know. And I also should mention, this is a concern to us as a public piece of public property. The councilman has taken money from his war chest. He's given it to the maximum amount to fellow members of the city council in order what? To get votes to pass the legislation. This is the problem. This is what happened with Sheila Dixon back when she ran. The developer giving. We want this to be a public. This needs to be a public process, not a private process behind closed doors. And this legislation was not generated in the normal manner for public.
I got you. And we understand, and I think this.
Well, that's what this discussion is about. It's about the legislation.
No. The discussion.
And the public property.
I'm sorry, Mr. Tafaro. The discussion's about what the host of the show has made the discussion about, and the discussion is about the bills themselves, not campaign donations. And not how other people feel that are not in this room to express those feelings.
Just one final thing. Eric has said publicly, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, that this is private property. The mayor went on Jane Miller's show and said it was private property. The land records, anybody can look it up on the ESTAT. It is owned by the mayor and city council of Baltimore, by us, the citizens. It's not private property.
Right. That well, that's a bit confusing because it's the land is owned
Not
by the mayor.
confusing in the least bit.
Right. But the buildings, the structures themselves is what I believe is privately owned. Is
No,
that
they have
incorrect?
the right to use those pavilions on the public property. They don't own the pavilions. They're subject to a ground lease for the length of the ground lease on the property. And if the ground lease were to terminate, they would not have continued right to use the pavilions.
Mhm.
And you're free to bring a lawyer on to check that. You can ask Carolyn Hecker, who's representing MCB as their attorney in this.
Yeah. I think we've reached our time as far as this particular bill. We got two more bills.
Can I respond very quickly?
Absolutely. Then we must move on.
Thank you. Couple things, David. One, the pavilions are in fact privately owned. That can be debated another time. You can have that debate with any attorney that you want. But those buildings are in fact privately owned.
I am an attorney also, by the way.
David, if you could provide me the same courtesy that I've extended to you and not interrupt me, I would deeply appreciate it. Number two, I heard you say prominent people in the city. There are 585,000 people that live in the city of Baltimore. How do you define someone who is prominent? Because I have hundreds and hundreds of constituents across the 11th district and neighborhoods like Bolton Hill and Druid Heights and Upton and Heritage Crossing and Marble Hill, Madison Park, McCullough Homes, Mount Vernon, downtown, the west side of downtown, Poppleton, Federal Hill South, Otterbein, Key Highway, Locust Point, Port Covington, Riverside, South Baltimore, Sharp Leadenhall, Seton Hill, and Ridgely's Delight, who support this project. And I want to understand when I hear something like, well, there are no prominent people. Does someone who is prominent, after you define for me what prominent is their voice, is their opinion more important? Because last time I checked, this city charter amendment needs to go to the qualified voters of Baltimore City, not the prominent ones. So I'm curious if you can clarify that for me, because I struggle when I hear language like that.
Well, I mentioned some of the people. I can also mention Carl Stokes, former city councilman, Ricky Spector, Leon Bridges.
Well,
I've mentioned specific people,
yeah,
including Bob Embry, Jay Brody. They come from all corners, but they're people who are familiar with it and have been involved in the development of the Inner Harbor.
This isn't an intent to to discuss about how people feel who are not in the room today. We invited you in the room to hear what you thought, and to hear what your concerns are. Not to carry messages for anyone else that had every opportunity to be here today to express it for themselves. And I don't want to get involved in the hearsay, part of this. What I want to get on the table today is what the bills say and what they don't say, and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and what we think the impact is on the harbor and on the citizens of Baltimore today and in the future. And if we can, narrow conversation down to those points, I think, we'll give the people some information and not fodder and gossip. But I want to move to the second bill here, which is 23-0446, which is for the purpose of amending the description of Inner Harbor sub-district and amending the bulk and yard regulations for the sub-district. Councilman, can you tell us what bill number 23-0446 is and what it does?
Absolutely. So C5IH is a specific designation of zoning. I think there's 50 or 60 different zoning designations in the city. For example, my home where I live is zoned R8, and there are certain restrictions for each of these categories.
R1C here.
R1C, there we go. All right, so in each zoning classification, there are controls over height, over density, and over uses. And what this does is not specific to the properties themselves, but this does directly impact the properties. This is a change not to a specific address or parcel, but a change to that entire designation. Now, that designation only exists within the Inner Harbor. There are other designations that are specific to certain geographic areas. And essentially what this does is it removes the height restriction from that C5IH. So any property that's zoned C5IH would lose that height restriction. And this change would make the area in the Inner Harbor consistent with the surrounding areas directly west on the other side of Light Street and directly north on the other side of East Pratt Street.
Understood. Mr. Tafaro?
Eric, it would be helpful to say, what is the current restriction?
100 feet. It's 100 feet.
And how tall are the current pavilions?
Off the top of my head, I'm going to say in this plus or minus 60 feet. Does that sound right? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right. I've heard 50 or 60 feet. But I think that's an important thing to note, that this is a dramatic change. And even in the renderings that MCB released, it shows that you're cramped. Well, I know we're not going to get into the plans, but what applies across the street does not necessarily make sense in a public park next to a promenade. So that's all I would say.
Right. And what would the height? Would there be a height restriction at all as a result of this bill?
For me?
Yeah.
No. The height restriction would be lifted.
Okay.
Now, what MCB has proposed, again, don't have this specific height off the top of my head, but I'm going to say it's about 350 feet for the two residential towers. David, does that sound about right?
That does sound about right, yes.
360. There are additional controls that are in place, specifically the ground lease that we were talking about before. So the ground lease can include certain conditions within it, and that ground lease has to be approved, just like any ground lease, by the Board of Estimates. I will note that, some of the buildings that are near adjacent to Harborplace, the World Trade Center, which is in the Inner Harbor, 405 feet. The Transamerica building, 529 feet. 414 Light Street is a hair over 500 feet. 100 East Pratt Street, directly across the street, 418 feet.
Understood. And this, I'm sorry, the footprint that this restriction would be removed for is the area that we discussed before, south of Pratt, east of Light, and north of
Conway.
North of Conway.
Yep.
Okay, so it stops at Conway, doesn't go below that. Got it. And gentlemen, just really quickly, I want to take a minute to acknowledge that we do have another guest that has joined us today. Klaus Philipson, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule today. Just want to give the voters a brief. Klaus Philipson is president of ArcPlan Inc., an architecture and urban design firm in Baltimore, specializing in award-winning community revitalization, adaptive reuse, historic preservation, and transportation projects since 1992. Philipson writes on urban issues on his blog, Community Architect, and Community Architect Daily, and authored Baltimore Reinventing the Industrial Legacy City, published by Routledge. Phillipson has participated in several advisory panels of the Urban Land Institute across the U.S. and is engaged in a number of community groups and nonprofits. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Claude.
Sorry about being late.
No, we certainly understand time and schedules. So we have already covered Bill 230444. We're currently on 230446. The councilman gave a briefing on the bill. Mr. Tafaro has accepted that briefing as being accurate, and there wasn't much to add there. But if there's anything you wanted to discuss about Bill 230446, which essentially removes the height restriction off of what is considered the Inner Harbor Park C5 1H designation as far as zoning is concerned. Would you like to weigh in on the zoning amendment?
Well, my question is kind of fundamental. Why the removal of or the change of zoning restrictions is first in the process before the project has been vetted in all the aspects that normally projects are vetted when the city engages with a developer. And so if at the end of a vetting process it's necessary to change the zoning to accommodate a vetted project, then that is one thing. But in this case, the vetting has not occurred. There is no evidence that the height limit has to be removed in order to make work what the public has said in these public meetings, what they want to see at Harborplace. And insofar, that is a major question. The other one has to do with urban design and the fact that the harbor master plan that was in effect from Wallace Roberts Todd in the original version created a frame on the far side of Pratt and Light Streets, and that was the higher outside frame that defined Harborplace. And if anything inside, with the exception of the World Trade Center, was lower in height. And so if we are changing the height limits inside that frame, we are really changing also the definition of the space we are talking about.
Right, I understand that. And let me first mention, as far as the architecture, and I certainly hope you will join us tomorrow evening as we'll get a little bit deeper into that aspect of the plan directly with MCB. But I do think that I feel that it is relevant that you bring it up today as well, because it is the impetus for the legislation, or part of it there anyway. And but as far as addressing the question and concern that you raised about whether or not the plan was vetted, and whether or not the vetting process and why the bills were felt to be needed to move forward, we'll let the councilman address that.
Thank you, Klaus. Great to see you today.
Thank you.
I would say that the bills have been vetted. The proposal has been vetted. It's been to UDAP, Urban Design Architectural Advisory Panel, twice now. It has been to Planning Commission. We had 2 marathon meetings at Planning Commission. At Planning Commission, there was a unanimous vote of 9-0 to make a favorable recommendation to the City Council's Economic and Community Development Committee. And the next step in the process to continue vetting this project is the 3 bills, these 3 bills that we're discussing today, those hearings in the Economic and Community Development Committee on February 13th. So this is the standard process by which a development project that requires land use entitlement is vetted. So it would be helpful to understand if there's specific ways that you feel it could have been vetted or should have been vetted through official city channels in which you believe that it has not been, so that I can more fully respond to that.
Well, just clarify, when you introduced the 3 bills, that was, I understand, the day or the day after they were revealed to the public. And so the very first step that you initiated with the introduction of these 3 bills was the revisions of the zoning restrictions that are currently in place. And that is true now. In the meantime, certain vetting procedures have occurred, but it still seems to me that from the perspective of a councilman who is responsible to the public for the public interest, it would be the first thing you ask, is this proposal furthering what people want to see at the harbor, at the inner harbor? And does it do what we all want? And is it doable? Is it practical? Does it have all the aspects that it can be realized? And when you take the super block or some other prominent projects that have gone through a process that is, of course, not totally comparable, because in the case of the super block, everything belonged to the city. In this case, here we have the split property. But nevertheless, it begins with what are you actually proposing, and not with what do I need to shift in my regulations to make it happen.
So, again, Klaus, I would disagree. More often than not, when someone is seeking a land use entitlement to build something, they are not nearly as advanced in a proposal as to what specifically they want to build prior to requesting introduction of a land use entitlement. Again, David is familiar with this process, as we heard, from his bio and his experience developing in Baltimore City. So if the question is, why were the plans not released earlier by MCB as to what they sought to build, and the proposal that is currently on the table, I believe that there has been a reasonable justification for that, specifically with respect to the community engagement process that they underwent prior to putting these plans together and releasing them to the public. But again, there are very few proposed development projects that I can recall in my 9.5 years on the council in which this level of detail and due diligence was available at the time of the request of introduction for the land use entitlement.
Eric, if I could just respond to 2 things. One is, I think Klaus has kind of referred to this. This whole inner harbor was subject to a master plan done by Wallace, McHarg, Roberts, and Todd, adopted in 1964. And then it was amended through a public referendum to allow the 2 limited pavilions to go in to activate the inner harbor. There have been lots of ideas, and I did refer to the Inner Harbor 2.0, which was not an official master plan, but it was commissioned by the Waterfront Partnership. We have skipped that step of updating the master plan. The second thing is, you mentioned my experience. I mentioned, first of all, this is public property, so there is a distinction. It's also not just any public property. It is the heart of Baltimore City. But I developed Waterloo Place, which was then owned by the city in Mount Vernon. It'd been a vacant, they tore down the historic row houses in the 60s, and then it was a parking lot. until the city offered it in 1984. I lost in the competition initially, and then it was reoffered in 87. I won it. It was done through the normal processes the city conducts to get the best plans, and that is through a request for proposals. And it's somewhat analogous because the prior proposal, or when I competed the first time, there were 2 high-rises proposed for the site. I didn't think high-rises were appropriate on that site in Mount Vernon with the Washington Monument just up the hill. So I proposed and got approved the 4-story structures which follow the topography down St. Paul Street, down Center Street, Monument Street, and up Calvert Street. The parking garage is totally buried, but it was through a request for proposals. This is not this process. You said this is normal, what's being done with the Harborplace. It is not normal, and that's a fact. The city does not follow that practice on public property at all.
So, David, just to be clear, because I think
I made myself clear, but go ahead.
Thank you. We're gonna have to agree to disagree without being disagreeable. Here are the facts that are very important to know. The structures that are what are currently known as the Harborplace Pavilions of Light Street and Pratt Street, those were privately owned. The city cannot legally issue an RFP for something that is privately owned. Those structures were conveyed privately from one party, Ashkenazi Corporation, to another party, MCB Real Estate, through a private receivership process, which was overseen by a judge. And those were conveyed at a value of $83 million. That means that Party A, Ashkenazi, transferred those structures to the ownership of MCB Real Estate. Okay? And that was an $83 million transaction. And I think it is getting lost here that somehow the city has a legal ability or even a legal right to say, we are in the driver's seat and we are going to determine who can purchase private property from another private property owner through a public RFP process. That is legally simply not possible, period.
And I want to point out a couple of things. Number one, just for house cleaning, Councilman Costello is also on the Planning Commission and is very familiar with that process. So I just want the viewers to understand that. Number two, as far as that is a very interesting that the RFP has come up. And just for my edification, as well as the viewers, Mr. Tafaro, I'm curious to understand how the city could involve itself in an RFP process. If I could see that, just asking a question based on, I could see that if the city had conveyed, if the properties were conveyed to the city and they paid Ashkenazi the $83 million, and now the city owns it and is looking for a developer and plans and things of that nature, then they could put out an RFP. But so help the viewers understand how you saw that RFP process playing out.
And it's important to note that receivership process that was approved by a judge was a public process, and there was no one else. There was no private party. You mentioned several prominent folks in Baltimore City. There was no other private entity who expressed any interest and had an opportunity to hang on, David, and had an opportunity to engage in that process and compete for it.
Well, I can't get into the details, but let me just comment on a couple of things. I'm a developer, so I'm going to put my developer hat. I would never put a piece of property under contract or buy it if I didn't know what I could do with it. So I don't know if in fact MCB paid 83 million, then perhaps they overpaid for it, number one. Number two, what conditions did they get or promises did they get from the city or the state that made them think that it was worth 83 million? And the final point is, if nobody else competed for it, then he clearly overpaid for it, because it means there are not a lot of willing buyers for the willing seller of that property.
And
But
those
I
are
don't know the details of the transaction, so I can't
right.
comment. I'm just saying, then he overpaid for it.
Yeah, so I think
Right.
we are not really saying that the city could have issued an RFP in the process through the receivership. We understand that the city and the buyer of the property on top of the land are sort of co-joined at the hip here. So they have a partnership that is somewhat unique, because ground rent is not the usual condition in the city, but it happens to be the condition here. However, because it's a partnership between the city who owns the land and the buyer who buys the property out of receivership, whatever the price exactly was, I think Eric puts in all the debt burden that is on it. And at the time, it wasn't really owned by Ashkenazi anymore, because they lost it already, because they forfeited they forfeited the property when they did not serve their loan correctly. But regardless, we are not saying it could have gone through a conventional RFP process, but it does, at that point where there is this partnership, it does give the city control rights. And that's what we're discussing here with these three bills. The very first thing we're doing is giving up these control rights. And when you look at the amendment number 4 for the ground lease that is in effect now under MCB, it does stipulate that this design is going to be realized, and if there is a sale to another entity from MCB to some other owner, or if there was a considerable change in the design, it would have to be approved by the city. We don't know, it's not currently publicly available, what the ground lease looked like under Ashkenazi and before it was modified for MCB, but if it probably had similar control provisions in it, which would give the city some oversight as what's to be done here. And so the key question isn't really the legalities here, but the key question is, if the city would have gone out and made it public that the controls that are controlling what you can do on the site would be up for grabs, you would certainly have had a lot of people being interested in building apartments on one of the best pieces of real estate in entire North America. I mean, that
right. So that leads. Yeah. And I'm sorry to interject here, but I want to do a little bit of house cleaning. One is that it doesn't, based on that statement, doesn't sound like the objection is what the package is. It's just that it feels, I guess it sounds like it feels like the package wasn't made available to everyone, and which would have created somewhat of a bidding situation. Number two is that the ground lease was modified in, what was it, 68? I think I heard it said, to obviously to facilitate the building of the pavilions and to economically stimulate the area. Are we just going through a second iteration of that? And that's just, no one has to answer that question, but so there's precedent for modifying the ground lease at the harbor, and sure, whether or not we're at that, let's say, call it an inflection point based on where the situation is now. And City Voters Live did interview the principal of MCB, and I want to make sure this is clear. And the councilman touched on this earlier. There was, or at least we were told in the interview, that there was an extensive process by which they did get community feedback and community input. Now, I'm not saying that this is what we were told, and that drove that kind of drove the design plan and
well,
things.
I mean that is a
I think I covered that earlier too.
Yeah. You can certainly challenge it. I'm just telling you, for those who didn't.
I think we can define what we all agree on. We all agree on that it was from the get-go difficult to make any profit with these pavilions.
Right. And that
when the Rouse Company defined the pavilions as festival marketplaces, they did not make huge profit, and that was not the idea, and that the precedent that was set, that you have a commercial activity in this public space, was predicated on the notion that they provided an attraction and were synergistic with the notion of Harborplace as a park. And so people, there are bathrooms, and they can buy food, and they can sit down, and there are restaurants, and it's this. So the notion in the public outreach meetings that MCB no doubt did, that was everybody agreed on. We want whatever happens in the future, whether that is a renovation of the pavilions or whether they get demolished and something else get built, we want to bring attractions to the harbor that are authentic, that are Baltimore, that are water themed, and that make Harborplace a lively place, more so than it currently is. So I think we're all in agreement on that.
Can I add
Councilman?
One piece of clarification? Klaus, you had two things, actually. One, you had referenced the ground lease. That is publicly available. That was approved by the Board of Estimates. The second thing is I wanted to thank you for acknowledging that there was not an opportunity for an RFP.
That's the biggest source of misconception that I've seen in the group.
I hope that David can hear what you said, because I think you did a very good job of succinctly explaining why the city couldn't engage in an RFP. But the point of contention throughout this process, and Klaus, you hit the nail on the head. It simply was not legally possible.
Eric, I'm going to have to take issue with Klaus. We're not fully, these documents have not been sent out to the public for us to analyze. But if the lease had been done initially, it's a ground lease to the Rouse Company for the right to build the pavilions. The city would have retained the right. So if they decided to turn the pavilions into nightclubs, the city would have presumably been able to say no to the Rouse Company. That's not the public activation we were talking about. So, and I think Klaus referred to this, there was some degree of control that the city would have retained over how these pavilions got used. If they got blacked out, closed down, that they would have a right to step in. That would be normally the case the way a ground lease was done. It's done that way with leases in malls and all over the country.
That's a great.
I don't know technically. The city could have. Now, they already signed a new lease, so why didn't they do an RFP on extending the ground lease and made it open to the public? They could have done that. I assume they could have done that legally. So I'm not going to accept the view that an RFP could not legally have been done. I don't buy it.
That's great contextually when we talk about what the intent was 55 years ago. I don't necessarily dispute that, or more specifically, I don't opine on that. That being said, contextually, that is entirely not germane to the point that the city could not do an RFP. The city cannot do an RFP for a piece of underlying land, which the mayor and city council owns, in which there are structures built on it, which are privately owned. That would create a violation of the property owner's constitutional rights. You're aware of that. And it simply would not be legally binding. So
Eric, we are, let's not harp on this too much, but
Sure,
if
sure.
we want to go backwards here in time, there was unfortunately a pretty long period in which this thing was in receivership, and before that a very long period where Ashkenazi did not invest in these pavilions. In that entire period, the city and the mayor, to his credit, when he came to office, immediately acted on that. The city had an opportunity to act on this. It would have been possible to say, look, we are changing the rules here. We have a resilience package to deal with. We have federal money for that. We have a report about the promenade. We need to do work on it. We have land that is potentially larger by adding the demolished fountain area of McKeldin Plaza. We have certain aspirations to change the street grid. So we have a larger envelope of land that we can look at other than just the footprint of the pavilions. And therefore, we are putting out an incentive package to entice more people to be interested to get these pavilions out of receivership. That would have been very possible. The city did not do that. And what the current suspicion is that this particular offering, that this is all a little more flexible than it used to be, was only made to one party.
Right. And I think we're speaking to a decision, and certainly we would happily invite the mayor who makes these decisions on to the show with this panel, and I think those questions would be substantially appropriate for that conversation. Today we're dealing with the 100-foot height, and then the last bill, which I'm hoping we can squeeze in. We can squeeze in here, but Claus, I hear you, and I don't disagree personally.
And
I don't want to get into my feelings today because this is more about you guys.
If you go into the point that you want to focus on right now, and we cannot redo what was not done back when sure. This thing was languishing out there. Now the question is, okay, MCB bought it, and what do we allow them to do, and what don't we allow them to do, and what did the public process really tell us, and what is the public interest, and how can it be made economically viable? That's really the set of questions that led to these bills. And I think we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater right away by saying the only way to make this economically viable, to have new additional attractions at the Inner Harbor, is to build 900 apartments that are obviously revenue generators. And my question really it's also kind of a design question, of course, is what is in the MCB package that is public use and public attraction and beyond what could already be accommodated in the pavilions? I mean, whatever the first floor area of these buildings is that MCB is proposing, and what they are proposing inside of those first floors is super similar to what the pavilions can hold and what they were originally. And beyond that, we just get apartments, and all the rest of it is public investment. So that to have floating promenade, to have this park added that McKeldin Plaza constitutes, to have this Freedom Park there, and all of that is public. That is not what MCB offers. So what are they actually offering for these 900 apartments? So why, Eric, are you so compelled to give them the keys and take away all the locks or whichever way we want to phrase this. You take away the locks, which is the height restrictions and the restrictions that there could be no residential use. Why did you do that? Why did you feel compelled and feel like that's the only way we can move forward?
We are now on our fourth mayor that I have served with: Mayor Brandon Scott, Mayor Jack Young, Mayor Catherine Pugh, and Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who all tried tirelessly to find a way to take this property from Ashkenazi because they ran it into the ground. And it's not just 4 mayors or an army of lawyers at the law department. It is organizations who have understood, such as the Greater Baltimore Committee, the Downtown Partnership of Baltimore, the Waterfront Partnership of Baltimore. There are organization after organization that recognize the significance of this property and the abhorrent condition that it currently is in, and the need to revitalize this area to help grow the city. Those are facts. And no one has found a way to take this from Ashkenazi. In May of 2019, they went into the receivership process. And this has gone through a very lengthy receivership process and came to closure late this summer in 2023. What we're talking about right now is 100-foot height maximum and increasing that, right? That's City Council Bill 23-0446. A private property owner has come forward with a proposal that is going through a normal development process. And I recognize, let me be very clear, I recognize the unique nature of the site that we are talking about. I recognize that this is the only geographic area that is specifically outlined in the Baltimore City Charter, which is our founding document of government in Baltimore City. I recognize that there is a very lengthy and contentious history behind how this property was originally developed, what that process was, competing charter amendments, how this property, if I'm not mistaken, was conveyed for next to nothing to the Rouse Company, contrary to the current situation. And I think it's important to note contextually when we talk about those buildings and what it cost to convey those buildings, to convey. Is that you?
Is it?
That's
sorry.
I think that's Desmond's note to get me to wrap up here.
No.
But I think all of that is important to note. We've been through a very lengthy public input process, which is very, very far from over. I just hosted a forum. We had about 130 residents attend at the Maryland Science Center. The project team has continued to stay engaged. Is 900 residential units the appropriate number of units that should go there? I don't know. Many people say it's too small. We had an architect at UDAP last week who said we should have more density there. I think that's all subjective. But what I do know is that we all collectively agree that something needs to happen there. Something needs to happen there, and it needs to be something that's big, and it needs to be something that's visionary. And most importantly, it needs to be something that's inclusive, where everyone in the city of Baltimore is welcome there. And what has been proposed is certainly all of those things, and especially is inclusive.
And then,
if I can just respond real quickly to Klaus's point and Eric's, if the purpose is to reactivate the harbor, and to Klaus was saying, well, you're building an apartment building and you're basically providing amenity space that may be the same as what we have with the pavilions. Wouldn't it be a lot cheaper if, in fact, the $83 million is correct that he paid? And MCB has said it's going to need $400 million in public money to do all the things that he wants to do. Why doesn't the city just pay $83 million to him and figure out a way to reactivate the harbor with the pavilions or some variation on the pavilion?
Mr. Jafar,
When you find out where the $83 million is
Well,
located,
where's the $400 million going to come from?
hang on, I'm going to answer that. I'll give you my phone number so you can call me and let me know. So the $400 million for public infrastructure covers three areas, David. And hang on, Desmond, one second, because we've talked about this. So you know this already, but I'm going to repeat it again for the benefit of our listeners today. It covers three pieces. That covers the improvements to the public promenade. It includes modifications to the lanes on Light Street and Pratt Street, and it includes public park space. $67.5 million has been secured by Senate President Bill Ferguson. There's a significant amount of that funding that is expected to be funded by the federal government. There is also the Red Line, which is inevitably going on Pratt Street. So there are a number of in-kind contributions related to that shall be, not maybe, not might, not could be nice, shall be funded by the state of Maryland. If you've listened to Governor Westmore talk, you know that the Red Line is coming and it's going down Pratt Street. So I just want to be clear when we talk about the things that would be nice to connect this project so it is no longer on its own island, so that it is accessible to everyone, so that it is inclusive to all. Those things have to happen eventually. And those things aren't new things, right? The promenade last saw major improvements about 23 years ago. That promenade was originally built 50 years ago. There have been plans to reduce the lanes on Light Street for some time as part of Downtown Partnership's plans for McKeldin Plaza, which, Klaus, you are familiar with, you have written about before, right? And the closing of the Calvert Street Spur, that those plans date back to 2008, 2009. The Red Line was something that was supposed to happen, right? And was killed in like early 2015. So these things are not new concepts.
I think we can also agree.
Hang on. These are not new concepts. These are not new capital needs that have come up because a developer has said
they are not funded.
This thing.
They're not funded, exactly.
There are capital needs all across the city of Baltimore and all across America that are not funded. We need to build a new Vietnam Veterans Memorial Bridge on Hanover Street connecting South Baltimore and Cherry Hill. That's not funded, but we're still planning for it, and we're still going to find a way.
We don't need to argue about these improvements.
Hang on, Klaus, I'm not done. And we're going to do it. I didn't interrupt you. We're going to do it with significant capital support from the state of Maryland and the federal government. So we have to do these things. And these things are going to happen whether or not MCB had acquired this property and whether or not we move forward with the plans as proposed and whether or not the qualified voters of Baltimore City approve this charter amendment on the ballot in November.
Well,
okay. Klaus, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to give you 2 minutes here, and then we're going to try to move on and go through a wrap up here.
Well, that is what Eric just said. Actually, confirms what David and I said, which is that the investment that MCB does and these public improvements are somewhat separate. And the parts that we all like are these public improvements. We do like the additional park space, and we do like all of that stuff, that the roads get road diet and that the barriers are removed and so forth. I would say that the Red Line is on Pratt Street is not yet decided. I mean, maybe Eric knows something that is secret, but so far the public is informed that there are 3 alternatives, and these alternatives will be decided sometime in the spring. And there are good arguments to put it on Pratt Street, but there are very good arguments to not put it on Pratt Street. So that's one thing. So in any way, if it is separate, that these public amenity improvements are not funded by MCB and the 900 apartments, that leaves really the question at the core of these 3 bills why MCB needs to build 900 apartments in order to run these public uses on the first floor.
Well, those are business profit and loss questions that would be for MCB. And what I've learned in the interview is they ran the math. The first thing that they said that they need to be, the project needs to be economically viable for now and into the future. I think we all agreed earlier when we discussed the existing pavilions and that they weren't profitable, right? And no one's going to do anything that's not profitable. So I think we all agreed on that point, that the current pavilions are not doing what a private owner needs them to do, and I think that's a consensus. I think that we all agree.
I don't think there is consensus, but I hear you.
Well, I think there's
been no public debate about that.
Well, I think there might. Well, I did hear you say, Mr. Tafaro, that there would have been a lot of interest if everyone knew what they could possibly do, right? So there was no interest when it was due with what's currently there, but there would have been a lot of interest if they had the opportunity to build 900 units. So that tells us right there that the current model, I think we can all somewhat agree that it's not, the festival marketplace is not a profitable model, and currently the buildings are privately owned.
There are a lot of people that disagree with you, with all respect, Desmond. We've talked to a lot of people who have a different view than that.
Of course. And that's not, I'm not saying that's my views. I'm trying to regurgitate what I'm hearing.
Yeah, right. But even if you agree to that this is hard to make a profit on these pavilions themselves, we have models in this city where developments take sort of a lost leader like Cross Street Market and Caves Valley. Caves Valley owns a lot of apartments in Sharp-Leadenhall and built and developed them there. And they bought the Cross Street Market as an amenity that adds value.
They didn't buy it, Klaus. They
got the rights to work on it.
A 15-year lease with 7 5-year options.
Yes, okay.
They were responsible for the improvements. They do not own the improvements. So that's
correct. It's still city market, but it's the concept was that something that is not necessarily making money is an amenity to something else that the developer has nearby. That same is true for Broadway market. So these city markets were changed in their character to be some kind of food hall, which I imagine is very similar to what.
It's great, except the structures of all 6 public markets, Cross Street, Lexington, the Avenue, Northeastern, Broadway, those are all owned by the city. These buildings, the key difference here, these buildings are privately owned.
Which brings us back to the what we discussed earlier is, could the city have come up with $83 million to acquire these buildings and treat them as those other venues that we know that are owned by the city, like Lexington Market? And that's not a question that we're any of us are here today going to answer here today. There's only one person that can answer that question, and we would certainly invite them, to answer that for us. I think the Inner Harbor is a unique place. It is a commercial place. It's a place where, we want everyone who comes to see the Orioles or the Ravens or comes to gamble at the casino or comes to Top Golf. We hope everyone that comes to the city stops through the Inner Harbor, and we need it to be something that it's not today. We didn't get to the last bill. Unfortunately, we're running up against the clock here. Maybe we can discuss it, very quickly. I think the conversation really steered away from the bills and a little bit more, into tomorrow's conversation. But last bill, 0448. What are we amending here? The urban renewal plan.
So this is the urban renewal plan for the Inner Harbor, and what this does a couple of things, but essentially reclassifies development areas 13 and 15A, which are the Pratt Street Pavilion and the Light Street Pavilion, respectively, to commercial residential. It reclassifies development area 14 from public to commercial public to allow for construction of the retail component. limits the size of that building to 3 stories and a maximum of 20,000 square feet. And then it removes some other development controls within the URP. For our listeners out there, an urban renewal plan is essentially an extra layer, if you will, on the zoning code. And it does some other things. It also provides, or when they were first established in the 70s, provides additional acquisition and disposition authorities for the city of Baltimore. So this makes amendments to that existing urban renewal plan in the Inner Harbor, which is kind of that extra layer of zoning, if you will.
So we have a bill that amends the charter, a bill that amends the zoning, and a bill that amends the renewal plan.
Yep.
And I'll leave it to you, gentlemen, to if you would like to discuss the urban renewal amendment.
Well, I just, in the context of the pavilions, I just got to go back to a point that relates to the urban renewal plan. And that is, I think by David Bramble's own admission, he did not tell anybody publicly of his intent that he was going to demolish the pavilions until the day before the announcement on October 30th. And in all the civic engagement meetings that took place before October 30th, he was soliciting views. And to my knowledge, and we've talked to a lot of people that were participants in the meeting, never said he was proposing the high-rise buildings or that he was planning to demolish the pavilions. He was thinking about what would be the best solution. And that's part of the problem, that this, on October 30th, these high-rise towers, the opportunity to build an office building in the public park was exploded onto the city for the first time. And so people who had been in meetings with him were shocked. And Rebecca Hoffberger is one of those people that was in the meetings. She offered her own ideas. The Waterfront Partnerships Plan, Inner Harbor 2.0, and I might add, and I'm going to say this, the Waterfront Partnership is the steward of our Inner Harbor. And they don't really support this plan. They are really being quiet because of arrangements they've made with MCB.
David,
they had a plan 10 years ago.
David, I have to stop you right now because I'm a member of the board of directors for both the Waterfront Management Authority and I'm a member of the board
and
of
directors.
What are you
going to tell me, Eric?
Partnership of Baltimore, that WMA and WPOB do not have a position on this. And they do
not an official position. I've talked to them though.
David,
yeah, but
David, stop.
Mr.
They do not. David,
the problem is, Eric, that people are being silenced.
David, you are
city members on this board.
David, you are disparaging an organization.
No, I'm not.
That I am an uncompensated member of the board of directors of. And I cannot allow you to do that.
Mr. Tafaro,
that is simply not true.
If the Waterfront Partnership wants to call in, we'll put the number back up. If they want to join the show, we should be speaking, for ourselves today.
And they did submit a letter of, for what it's worth, submitted a letter of support for the bills before the Planning Commission. But to suggest that there's some type of see, this is the problem here, is that you're suggesting that something nefarious is occurring behind the scenes.
That's correct.
And that I understand that's correct. That's why I said it. And what I'm saying is that could not be further from the truth. You are disparaging organizations like the Waterfront Partnership who are doing incredible work in our community.
Just a moment, Eric. We do know that the Waterfront Partnership has entered into an agreement with MCB relative to the promenade. And that is the reason why they're not being vocal. They are also, it is a fact, to use your use of words, that they commissioned Inner Harbor 2.0, prepared by under the supervision of Air St. Gross. It did a public vetting of ideas before it was published in 2013. And they are ignoring their own plan. That is a fact.
Okay.
If I could just say back to Desmond's point, here are 3 bills. And so these 3 bills are the 3 layers that controlled what happens at the Inner Harbor. And that there are 3 layers just indicates how important it was for the people back then when they codified all this. how important this land was to them and that these controls would be in place. And Eric has recognized correctly that if we want to change the rules, we have to touch all three bills or all three sets of regulations. So when we discuss this today, just so that the public also understands, these three bills cannot be looked individually. This doesn't make any sense because you have to change them all three in order to you have to change all three layers in order to allow what MCB is proposing. So that's why we always get immediately into the discussion of what's the logic behind this. And so the logic is, if I can't run the public uses that were previously permitted in a low-rise building in these pavilions, if I can't run that for profit, then I have to change the rules. That seems to be the logic that I hear here. And there are some options that the city would have had. The city could have bought the pavilions from out of receivership. Ashkenazi didn't want to sell them to them, but out of receivership, the price was considerably lower than 87 million. It was just, there is a debt burden on it, which when you are in receivership, usually the dollars that are unpaid debt are negotiated and they are not paid one-to-one. In most cases, when something goes out of receivership and is bought in foreclosure, the creditors get only 50 cents or 30 cents or something on the dollar. That is a matter of negotiation. That is not a given that you have to pay them back in full. But
right. And
I gotta run.
These are all details of a deal that we were not involved in.
No, but that drives the question now as to how much profit do you need to generate somewhere else on things that the public did not ask for, but that seem to be the price for getting what the public asked for. Is that a fair description, Eric, or no?
That's a question for the development team. Unfortunately, I have to run. I have a hearing at City Hall at 2 p.m., which I need to get downtown for right now. I'm up in Desmond's studio in Northwest. So I got to head out. But Klaus, David, it's always a pleasure to be with you guys. Appreciate the conversation. Desmond, I want to continue to stay engaged. If folks have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If I can't answer them, I'm happy to get you connected with someone from the project team. So we can get you an answer. And finally, I'll just say, I am very grateful that, at least in this process, that there is a component of this that will be required to go to the voters of Baltimore City, voters that live in the city of Baltimore, and that are the qualified voters, not just prominent folks, but everyone in the city will have an opportunity to weigh in on this. So I look forward to that.
And the last 20, give me 20 more seconds, Councilman.
Yes, sir.
And I just want to wrap up by saying this is only the beginning of the legislative process. We haven't even started the legislative process yet. The first hearing is February 13th. This is a bit of a preview, to get it on the radars for those who have input, that want to review the bills, that want to be a part of that process that's going to be taking place in City Hall. I think the first committee hearing is February 13th. Thank you for your time, Councilman. I'll go ahead and wrap up.
Thank you, Eric, for the opportunity for robust discussion.
You guys are great.
About something very important to Baltimore City.
Closet David, I hope that you guys will join us tomorrow evening. MCB will be in these same seats. Format will be very similar to what we're experiencing today. Can't thank you enough for giving me an opportunity to meet you here today and for participating. And I look forward to seeing you both tomorrow night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I hope that that was engaging for most of you, and we'll see you tomorrow night, 7:00 with MCB.
Chuck Classic.